Stay right there. What are you waiting for? Kill them! Kill them both! No, wait a minute. Is it money you're after? I'll give you as much as you want.
May the saints forgive you, because I won't.
I'll start off with an anecdote, Andrew, just because it's a good one and it speaks highly of you. And obviously, I'm going to mention Brad Kelly because he popped into my DMs and was like, "You need to." We didn't speak, but like we were friendly, but we never spoke. So he popped into my DM saying, you need to read this book. It's incredible. It's the best book." He said, "This is quote best book 2025." And I said, "Okay. You're a really good writer, Brad. I trust you. You have a great podcast. You know a lot about literature. Like, let's see what it is." So then you and I exchanged some messages, and you very kindly and very generously sent me your book, which I really appreciate. And I then proceeded to read your book and then also listen to you on your own podcast. You're a veteran podcaster, Warhorse, very excellent. And also on many other podcasts because you've been kind of doing the circuit, which is great because you want to sell your book. And I want you to also sell your book. So thank you so much, Andrew. And I'm going to call you Andy for the podcast. But just for right now, I'll let you introduce yourself and your amazing work, Crowbar. And also your other novel, King of Dogs. And perhaps the episode title will be a play on those two ideas. We'll see. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Jin. I'm really happy to speak with you. As far as like introducing myself, just before we hit record, we were talking about where we live, and I'm very much a Pacific Northwesterner in the U.S. I've lived all over many other states, but that's a big piece of it now that I've entered middle age. And we also mentioned that I'm a father, and obviously a writer, and then music is really important as well. But we can get into all other aspects, but that's kind of the snapshot picture.
Well, it's interesting because I had an episode with Simon. I'm forgetting his surname, but he has a black metal project called Brahmastra, and he wrote an entire album on Project Montauk. And actually, all of his albums are sort of based around this idea of MK, but particularly with kids. That's like his kind of like research focus. But all of his albums are basically about like deep conspiracy, we'll say. And
Really?
so, yeah, you would actually really like him, and I'll send you his contact details after. But
Okay.
so we talked about this, and I don't know that much about music. I'm not that kind of millennial. I'm like, I was always like, I'm goth. I'm like into magic, but like I'm like what I like is like even alternative for like the right wing Twitter millennials, whoever they are. I don't listen to black metal. I don't listen to like all that stuff. I'm very eclectic, but it's not really in that category. So I'm usually pretty quiet about those kinds of things because I don't want to seem uncool, which is like millennial death kiss.
Right. That's really interesting because this hasn't come up in any discussions around Crowbar or maybe anywhere else, but the way I didn't really have this plan, but it's worked out with both of my novels that I will do like a big songwriting batch, like right before I start the book. And I don't know why this is, but most of those songs are in one way or another, they're almost like, oh, different little seeing the same material through a different kind of lens or facet. And I mean that, I mean, that would sort of make sense to anyone. Like, sure, you could write a song about the same stuff that you write a book about, but usually these songs are very strange. They're not really narrative. They oftentimes don't. The characters in the songs will kind of they'll be analogous to how the characters wind up in the books, but they're just slightly, like, almost sort of in a slightly different world, if you will. And yeah, that's very odd that you just happen to know a guy who seems to be doing something similar, because I mean, all of these songs are very much about conspiracy. I mean, really about, now that I think about it, I mean, there's, the octopus is in there, Sabbatean, old histories of blood libel and all manner of odd stuff. And none of it was really planned that way, and I didn't even actually notice it until kind of Crowbar had taken shape.
Well, I've talked a little bit about this in my episode with the other. Oh, I guess I've had multiple writers on, but the one of the primary was Dustin Cole, who's a poet, but he's also written novels, and he for the book After Sunstone, and him and I talked about this idea of synesthesia in regards to words, and synesthesia in regards to music. So if you perhaps experience, I'm not saying that people who write necessarily have synesthesia as in like experience like visual or audio effects from whatever object, but I do find in my own experience that because words to me are associated with a certain color, music, certain kinds of music also has the quality of color. So I often, even though it's very specific for me and it's more like the specific quality of sound rather than maybe the words itself. So maybe there's a more topical way that you're kind of tuning in to that thing, like the broader idea. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry. The broader theme, you're kind of color matching, but maybe it's not color for you, but there is a kind of click that happens in your brain that you're like, okay, these two things are overlapping. And even though song lyrics are much more about economy of space and sound cool together, all of that. And of course, writing is, I mean, you're a better writer than me, so I won't speak on it, but I just mean that it's a different style. So, but I think that you're perhaps marrying the two ideas together because it's all, the music gives it the lyrics a layer, right? Like it gives it kind of a buoyancy, kind of whether the song is uplifting or not uplifting. I'm just mean it kind of raises them higher.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's probably actually pretty darn close to what that experience is like. I mean, I do a lot of like we mentioned Gurdjieff, again before we hit record, and I'm not a Gurdjieffian or anything, but
I'm not either. Full confession.
Yeah, I mean, I love that stuff. I think it's fascinating, and I have read it, a fair amount of his stuff, and it's been in my life for a long time. I have an uncle who introduced me to him, and a guy named Robert D. Rope, who, we could talk about him in some detail if you wanted, but the work, the idea of the work, of clearing your mind and just basically stilling the inner dialogue. I do a lot of different practices to kind of get around to that. And now that you mention, synesthesia, that you that's a pretty apt description. Whether or not it's, you know, perfectly technically accurate, I think that there's some amount of that experience where it's as if different ideas are being tagged or something in different ways or processed in different ways, and I can't really claim to understand the whole process, but that's kind of the thing, you know, of doing projects. You just sort of have to, at least I've found that I have to commit to the whole thing. And as I've done this many times now, it becomes a little bit more familiar. So yeah, maybe I will try and I don't know if formalize is even possible, but I will definitely allow some space if like songs want to come through before the next novel, or vice versa. I honestly don't have you know, a huge, I have some ambitions for sure, but as far as a master plan, you know, I can't claim to to really have one.
Look, I always joke about this on the show, being like, there are many different archetypes for a magician. So maybe a writer and a magician, maybe not the same thing, but Gurdjieff might disagree, actually. He might say that Jung would definitely disagree and say it's the same thing. I think it's also the same thing or a similar thing. So there's only so many archetypes that you can fulfill. And there's a natural archetype called the fool. And so a lot of magicians actually lean into this because it is easier to have so-called crossing the abyss, higher consciousness experience. You don't have to call it crossing the abyss, but that's how I would describe it. But it's easier to do that when you kind of are a little bit of a retard. So at least at first go, you kind of don't know what you're doing. But like something you said is very interesting because so Andrew, I know we talked a little bit about this pre-recording, but my greater meta project, you could say, for my show is to speak with as many. But now it's become about writers, since I've said that comment about writers also being very close, if not interrelated with the magician. But a lot of American occultists in general, specifically American contemporary. I'm not that I mean, I'm interested in like the medieval and all of that. And obviously I'm a tantric Buddhist. So for me, I draw a lot from Central Asia and like the sort of ideas that syncretize there. But I think for the show, I'm very interested in like the modern American sort of magical or history and anthropology. So a lot of modern contemporary magicians, people who were involved in crazy things in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, 90s, they're actually much closer to what you're saying. They're all about fundamental layers of consciousness, breathing, breath work, meditation, number one. I always say that as well, because that's obviously a fundamental core component for me, is sort of clearing the aggregations, as we would call them, of the mind. So, and so the words can then arise. That is kind of the idea. It also has like a very, I guess you could say, quote unquote, spiritual layer for people who are tantric Buddhists as well, because the words are fundamentally considered to be empty, but it doesn't mean nothing. It means luminousness and massless. So by clearing the aggregates, just like Gurdjieff kind of, it allows for the kind of spontaneity to arise, and like maybe it's closer to the primordial word, maybe it's not quite there, but something's happening. It's almost like it's a kinetic, spiritual, psychological, but it's not really psychological consciousness, higher consciousness process. At least that's the goal. So I think that I think many people are on this, we'll call it current, of like, what is the nature of consciousness? And also, maybe the nature of consciousness is also magic. I spoke with David Rankin very recently, who's for occult people, he's like, you want to just like fanboy all day, but he's a very accomplished ceremonial magician. His practice now, he's older than you, but he has young kids, like very young. And he was saying like he doesn't have time to do any ceremonial magic. All he does is 30-minute meditations every day. So I just thought what you said was probably the most profound point in contemporary like occult slash magical thinking is that it all comes from the mind, and it's all rectifiable also in the mind.
That's very interesting. I was listening to our mutual pal Brad on a podcast. I think maybe it was his own show or somebody else. No, it was a show called Heavy Board, and Brad was of the opinion that the interviewer asked him, "Do you think we're in the midst of an occult revival?" And Brad was just immediately like, "Yeah, absolutely." And I don't really, I mean, I like I said, I have 3 kids and I have a fourth on the way, and I honestly don't get out that much or listen to as many podcasts as I once did. But I was curious, what do you think? I think you probably agree with Brad on this point. Well, and what is that exactly, do you think? Like you said, it's a current. I can sort of identify with that. And how big do you think it is, and how is the American aspect of it really like kind of shattered, and it must have many parts and layers. Is that what you're finding?
So this is a great question. Thank you for asking, Andrew.
Yeah.
But so I've actually I agree with Brad 100%. We are in the midst of a quote unquote esoterica. Everybody's kind of revisiting the canon, and also there's a huge interest in occultism online in general. Just in general, it's just like very popular. I mean, you're on IG, you see it. You can look at mine, and everyone that I follow is just like everyone has an occult podcast, basically. At least on my side. I don't know about the normies, but for me, that's kind of where I'm looking. So I've actually packaged it. I'm not trying to like go total like out like far out there, like post Neptunian or whatever. But I did package it in a kind of neo-Gnostic framework called the Aeon of the Daughter. So it is similar to Age of Aquarius, and even Junger talks about like Aeonic cycles, like things moving into cycles of both decay and renewal. So in tantric astrology, actually the idea is that we're no longer in Kali Yuga. So we've sort of like we're transitioning, or we've transitioned away from it. And so that is the decayed cycle. And so we're in a period of flux, fire and flowers, if you want to call it that. That's what I've called it in the past. I don't mean it in a hermetic way. I just mean that we have to be less fixed, perhaps, in our like identities, our ideologies. I'm not saying discard it all. I'm not saying it's all bullshit at all. I'm just saying we can lift from the corpus or from the canon what is going to be pragmatic, useful, and also achievable in our lifetimes. So I think it's a very psychic aeon rather than a magic aeon. I think that is why people are moving away from the ceremonial kinds of formulations. And I think institutions, as we've seen through COVID, but way before that, 2008 is another one, but 2001 is perhaps the fundamental, you could say, Babylon working that sort of transitioned us into a kind of new, I guess, into the new aeon, whether it began then or not, or whether it began before or not. I think that it was kind of at least in consciousness and perception, we perceive that event and something fundamentally changed socially, societally, civilizationally. And to answer the other part of your question, like what role does America play? Well, American magicians are, in my opinion, the most interesting of all, because they're not as married to the quote unquote like European or like a traditionalist canon, and they never have been. And you can easily prove this by looking at American Christianity ad hoc. Scientology, I know that's not Christianity, I totally get it, but Elron was a magician, and he was clearly building on this idea of parafiction, metafiction, like lots of things that Nick Land talks about, but he was not the first. And there's this other idea of chronopoiesis. So mixing, just like a writer does, they mix in real life events, but they might mix it in a way that is a magical narrative. And then when you use meta magic, you're actually bringing like Kabbalistic or magical occult ideas, and you're placing it in the perhaps fiction, or perhaps it's more pseudo fiction. And you're actually creating like a magical work in fiction. Like you're calling it fiction, but it's really like a magical text, which is very if you're like a young, or were a young chaos magician like myself, you're familiar with like Don Webb and like all of these guys, Peter Carroll, and all of them who are talking about these exact things in the late 80s and early 90s, and how there's sort of an imperative for people who like have this idea of maybe freedom, but like not in any political necessarily overtone, but just people who want freedom of consciousness. You have to kind of rectify the canon as it is. And so in Buddhism, we would say that the way that we practice sorcery, because Tantra is sorcery, but it's also Buddhism. So the way we do it is to rectify ourselves. So, but there's obviously a more magical idea that you can also do this to sort of rectify the word or rectify ideas. And so I think I think a lot of this stuff is coming to the surface. I think you have people, again, to cite Don Webb, like he's been talking about this for like his whole career. And I think it's just an interesting, and he's a poet as well. He's a novelist as well. And everyone in his circle is really obsessed with H.P. Lovecraft. And whether or not H.P. Lovecraft is a magician, I know that this is like a hot debate sometimes on lit Twitter. I lean yes, simply because why do all these Left Hand Path and Kenneth Grant, especially like Typhonian Order OTO, they love they are not Kenneth Grant, they love H.P. Lovecraft, like love him, and they use it to do magic, to summon things, whether you think that that's real or not real. They believe it. So I just think that that's kind of what we're experiencing, is kind of the aftermath of these quote unquote magical societies kind of playing with fiction as reality, reality as fiction. And of course, the prime directive for any chaos magician is to attack consensus reality. So I would say that, I would say that you're doing that, but not necessarily I don't say you're doing it to like destroy consensus reality, but I think that you're kind of positing a speculative idea of what things could have been, what things are, and perhaps even, I'm not saying that you have a greater political project, but what things could be. Maybe that information can be gleaned in some ways, or at least that's things you're thinking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, you took aim and you hit me right between the eyes. I mean, there's no doubt that at the kind of I don't know how deep it goes, really. I was going to say second or third layers, underneath just sort of a fictional presentation there, and nobody else has really ever picked up on this. So I have to say I'm delighted, but also like sort of shocked, but I shouldn't be shocked, because I mean I do have some familiarity um with, I don't know, a variety. I can't say as I'm any type of scholar on just about anything, honestly. I'm just sort of eclectic. I've been around a while and pick things up. But back to your point about, in particular, I could say, like, I probably do have political, I don't know. I mean, we all sort of have political ideas or hopes, but and I can't say like I identify as a chaos magician. Not that I have anything against that. I don't even really know what it is. But I do tend to think of myself as a sort of this is going to sound kind of pretentious, but we might as well just go with it, is a sort of saboteur of sorts, and in a psychic sense. And when you kind of made this statement a minute ago, it reminded me that I put out this, a sort of like a marketing meme that I made about Crowbar, this novel I have. It's the meme of, I think it's an American soldier in Iraq, and he's standing sort of over a stairwell, dropping a grenade down, presumably to mess some people up, that are a few floors below or something. And the picture is just captured perfectly where the grenade has just left his hand. And so the meme template, everybody probably knows it already, but you can apply whatever you want to the grenade, to the soldier, to the context. And it did occur to me that this book, Crowbar, was that. It was a sort of psychic weapon. But when I say a weapon, I guess the truth is I have enemies. We how committed they are, and like what form this takes, and is still up for grabs. And I don't think of any, like, I'm not thinking of some one particular person. I do, for the audience, I mean, I was raised in Portland, and so the thing in the 70s when I was born was kind of like agnostic, at least where I'm from. And along the way, I did come to embrace a more some form of Christianity, and I'm baptized in the Orthodox Church. I don't usually talk about this, but this seems pertinent, and just to be transparent. But it's the church itself, and it's still very mysterious to me. And I can't say as I am like fully versed in it at all, but it's part of who I am now. And in the Orthodox tradition, the enemy, like the capital E enemy, is, I think that most people would describe this as, well, this is the devil, this is, and then, but that's actually just one layer of it. And the enemy winds up being, some version of ourselves in a lot of conceptions. And then, of course, all of a sudden you're kind of find yourself in, big questions of identity, like, how many of us are there? How connected are we to all other entities? And we can go down, you probably have the intuition that there's a huge rabbit hole right there. And I believe there is, and that's of course pertinent to Crowbar. If I'll just try and finish this one point and throw it back to you, is the effort of like change in terms of magic. I mean, I think you're right. That's any I'm a big fan of Parmenides, and he and Peter Kingsley is, I don't know if he considers himself a magician or not, but his work in the last couple of years kind of opened my eyes to a number of, I don't know, just ideas that I embrace. And one of those is just this idea of repetition. And I'm sure your audience is familiar with some of the lines of thinking pertaining to rhythm, music, leading up to poetry, eventually becoming some sort of bigger story like a novel. And that's all just to kind of try and say, it's a strange thing to try and write a novel now. And if you listen to, again, some of Brad Kelly's stuff or other guys in that sphere, there's almost no reason anymore to imagine that you can get rich at. You can, I mean, you can write like a romance novel, or you can write you can essentially, what I think of as selling your soul to make money doing this. And I'm kind of the mind that none of that matters anymore. And I don't know if that has to do with the Aeon shift or these, these types of conceptions that we're in. I always think of the carrier wave theory, that we're moving through something so much bigger than we can understand on a daily push-pull sort of level. And but I personally don't ascribe to like one theory or another about this carrier wave or these aeons, though I don't deny that it's just a matter of ignorance. I don't know one way or another because I haven't read that much about it. But in terms of the American magician slash novelist slash artist, I've said this before and I don't know how much love I get for it, but there's no denying, I don't know why anybody would even try, that this is a kind of there's a sort of cluster of qualities that and you can't quite separate the artist from the shamanic priestly sort of figure. And I also like to point out, because a lot of, if we say like folks more on the left or whatever, they will overlook that there's a warrior component to this as well. I think that discussions about the Greeks make this pretty clear, that war and poetry, I'm not saying they originate from some essential like Platonic source that's the same. I mean, they might, but they truck together, if you will. And we seem to be at a point where the commercial aspect of this endeavor of writing a novel or making an album has kind of been cordoned off and controlled to a degree that's, on the one hand, I think it has no power, if you will. It has no juice, no magic. And so all of that is just kind of lying like a crown waiting to be picked up. I'll stop there and throw it back to you.
That was great. That was really great. So basically everything you said is like the Aeonic themes. It's like the archons arise in your own mind. You don't have to use a Gnostic framework. I'm actually a very Christian friendly. I'm not Christian myself, but I did grow up in quite a religious household. I have no animosity to the church or to anything. One of my co-hosts, Solar Exile, he is my co-host, not one of my co-hosts, but we also do a group show, and but he's also been a co-host many times on this show. And so he was in the Orthodox Church for a long time, so I'm not that familiar with it. I grew up Roman Catholic, but I understand from things that he said, like it is, all institutions are like this, Andy. It's like the magical societies are no different. People want sort of the inner mystery, the inner temple religion, the more secret religion. They don't necessarily know or want the secrets, but they want
Yeah.
some more esoterica. And it's hard in the institution to sort of engage with that because you're not told. Like example that we've talked about is hesychasm. I think that's the correct term.
Yeah.
And how if you go to like a local parish priest, he will say like, you're not quite ready for that, like right away, if you just convert. And that this can make you go crazy. And so Kabbalah is very similar in some ways, like this thought of like you have to have like a deep kind of scriptural, practical knowledge of like what you're doing, because you can go very much off path. So to tie this into what you were saying about war and poetry, actually you can map it from maybe not a singular Platonic source, but perhaps one of the four elements. So there's an idea in Kabbalah that war and inspiration both come from fire. So Gevra. I know this sounds crazy, but it's actually not, because you can think of it like an example that is frequently given is if you light, okay, so say a piece of incense. So you light incense on fire, right? So it burns. The actual matter of the incense changes because the herbs and the powder gets transmuted into smoke. So that's the same kind of process. It's like it's the transmutation, it's the quick change, the very quick change. So any kind of quick change that can be ascribed to that sephira or that element of fire, if you want to say. And there's an old debate in all mysticism. Does the word arise from fire or does it arise from water? In Tantra, we would say the primordial word arises from water, but the secret word arises from fire. But both of those are of the same nature. Now, this is a very Buddhist way to sort of reconcile the paradox of that, because we say all words are empty, but a lot of Western magic doesn't necessarily draw that non-dual conclusion. But I do think it's interesting that there's this paradox of fire and water. You're talking about war. War is associated with the fire, with Gevra. That's even one of the ways it's translated. It's a way Crowley often likened it, but that's not really what it means. It's really about discrimination in terms of discrimination awareness, like being aware, selecting your words, maybe. That's maybe a good way to say it. Like the words come to you, you have the spark of inspiration, but you don't select all the words that are in your mind. You do it in a specific syntax. So that would be very Gevratic, coming into more a synthesis where you're putting the two ideas together. So I absolutely think that there's a metaphysical way to sort of marry that. And then my last point, well, I had quite a few, but I'll throw it back to you after this. America. I didn't say this when you asked me a little bit before, but I personally think in the Aeonic, so this is just my framework, and I'm not asking anyone to believe it. I say it's all speculative. I think it's real, but that's fine if people don't. I think America is kind of like, I'm talking about all of America, like North America, maybe even Mexico too. Like, I don't know, but I think it's actually the New World Island. That's what I've often called it. I think that where we live is special. I think it's untamed to a large degree. I'm talking natural environment and like the spirits, quote unquote, maybe of your own mind, but maybe also that dwell in the sort of regions and or places or mountains or places people think are quote unquote sacred, but it's also a reflection of your own mind as well. So I just want to say that I'm not saying like spirit, like go out and start like trying to tame spirits or whatever, but I think yes. And I think that the first way you do that is through what we talked about, is like meditation, knowing what is of your own mind rather than what is like an input. And once you do that, actually there's an idea in Buddhism, at least, or Buddhist sorcery, that you actually calm down the land spirits. If you are attained enough in being able to discern the difference between perhaps like what your conceptual ideas are and what is like that kind of empty Rigpa, Diamond Thunder, sort of like that space that is sort of clarity. Just an idea, but I don't know. You can respond to that. I'm sorry, Andrew.
No, that's fascinating stuff. That's one of the the thing you said about all of us sort of reaching for the more esoteric version of religion or mysticism. This has crossed my mind several times as we've been talking, and I think I'm not going to be able to. I keep trying to recall who the source was, and it may come to me later, but damn, I cannot remember who said it. But essentially, the idea was that if I want to say it was maybe even an Orthodox saint, which sort of, in Orthodox circles, this this makes a difference. This is kind of like a legitimizing force behind the idea, but I may have that wrong. But the idea was that if Christianity does not, in the coming era, which I agree, I think we're probably in that now, embrace a mystical element, it will die out. And I think that, after the show, I'm sure it'll the source of the quote, and I will come to me, and I'll forward it to you. But it's it is the case, in my experience, that if you go and you talk to priests about hesychasm, which is just simply, we Orthodoxy is very strange in America too. This is a silly rabbit hole or a line of thinking that we probably should not go down, because it's kind of boring as well. But
it's actually not boring. It's not boring, Andy, because I think it links the thread between like the sort of the new American religion or the new American Christianity or weird American Christianity to what we're talking about, traditional mysticism, because there's a very mystical strain in Orthodoxy.
There
There's
is.
Kabbalah in the cross. There's like, you can map it all out one to one. Like, it's very doable. It's not difficult. And the
Yeah.
saints are very mystical, and all of their experiences. And I'm not one to disregard like that stuff. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I want to tell you it's not boring at all for me or the audience.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'll take a few steps down that way then. I was going to say my experience has been in America that the hesychasm isn't, I don't think it's embraced in the same way that like the monks on Mount Athos embrace it. And I've read a few interesting books. There's one by a guy named Robin Amos, AM, I think that's how you say it, AMIS. And this is a guy who went to, he got some sort of special pass to go and spend a lot of time with these monks. And it he seems to be doing almost a Straussian sort of for those who know, you know, you can know sort of thing, which is to me very silly and very kind of a waste of time, but because it's a huge book to get through. So I'll give the audience, if kind of my takeaway anyway was that there is this very profound and specific esoteric tradition that and this is kind of a famous idea how Christianity was made exoteric at a certain point. But I am of the belief that not everything happened that way. And it seems to from Robin Amos's book, it becomes pretty clear that there's an inner tradition that is far less kind of and strict is not the right word, but like compartmentalized away from in theological terms. You know, they don't seem to spend a lot of time arguing about the various factions or between, you know, fights between religions. They seem to in some way have elevated themselves to a point where the words and the concepts there's far less friction. And so I often wonder about America and where this will go and all of the political aspects and, you know, I mean, the various identitarian aspects. I have no idea, but I can say that my takeaway from this book was that on the very inside of the heart, as far as I can tell, of Christianity itself on Mount Athos is very, very close to in practice and maybe like in experiential terms what I read from Buddhism. And you know, there's plenty of discussion about a guy named Father Seraphim Rose, and he I mean, I don't know if I need to introduce the audience to this guy, but suffice to say that he wrote a book, or he took part in the writing of a book. The actual author's name was, I think, Hieromonk Damascene, and it's called The Tao of Christ. And this is, I think, a spectacular book because it almost it's I mean, to speak of like magical text, it's truly sort of magical in the sense that the various concepts you can almost see in live time. Oftentimes I think the book is structured so that the Buddhist presentation or the Taoist, the sort of Zen version of it, I know I'm mixing these terms, but will be on one page, and then there'll be a kind of like a Christian version of that or an interpretation on the next page. And it's a mind-boggling study if anybody is into this sort of stuff. Like, where does Christianity go? What was really going on 5,000 years ago with concepts like ascended masters or inner church or you know, the psychic church. uh, I find all this stuff incredibly fascinating, and yeah, I'll throw it back to you.
No, it is incredibly fascinating. That's exactly what this show is about, Andy. So you definitely didn't take us off any path that I'm not in. Like, this is definitely a avenue I'd like to explore even further. But I think that that's a great sample of what Orthodoxy does have. And so I also recognize this, but I don't recognize it from like a outer like congregation member. I only recognize it because I maybe have I don't want to call it deeper knowledge, but it kind of like I've had crossing the abyss experiences. So maybe you're accessing higher knowledge, just like Greek Orthodoxy would discuss, or Orthodoxy in general. And I also think that Orthodoxy is non-dual, and they state it very plainly. And in my opinion, the non-duality is at least one of the keys, one of the primary keys to have those like higher conscious experiences. Whether you want to say it's with God or more dharmic, like more Buddhist, where it's not really theistic in a parallel way, but there's something similar in it. And I think that the only real disagreement that I would have with the Orthodox presentation is when they say the world is death. So for me, if you're truly non-dual, as Tantra Dharma or Vajrayana or whatever you want to call it, Tantric Buddhism would say, is that we would say that the world is the carnal ground, so the place where bodies are cremated, referring to actual cremation ground, but also conceptual ones. But it's also the garden. So it's always rectifiable, and it's maybe the same thing. Because like life and death happens, and we kind of sort of re-arise, and obviously we believe in rebirth. So maybe this is another difference, but we strongly believe in rebirth. So the idea is like you are born here, but the human world is actually not a punishment or a sin. It's actually considered to be the highest potentiality for rebirth. Higher than the gods, like you want to call like I know everybody on the right wing Twitter loves like the Vedas, and they hate me for saying anything like remotely critical of that, but I'm a Buddhist, so we reject the Vedas. So I don't know what they want me to say about it, but basically we're higher than the gods, and we're higher than the demons, and we're higher than we share the realm with the animals, but we are a little more agential than them. So maybe because we get to choose, right? And we get to choose like how we choose to be in the world and how we choose to act in the world. We're not supposedly driven by those more basal impulses, or we can actually become less driven by them through spiritual practice. So I would say that I like the view that the world is non-dual. It's not a garden of corpses necessarily, but yes, of course it can be. But conceptually, all of these things are just process of consciousness happens in your own mind. The bodies are buried in your own mind, just as the archons and the aeons themselves arise in your own mind. Like the aeon isn't like some like magic. I know you don't think. I don't think you think I think this, but it's not a magical sky fairy. It is it's the conceptual way that the sort of the wheel of time moves through, like we move through cosmic time, and then these are certain concepts that arise that are embodied by logos, embodied by the word, that we then can embody to sort of move through the aeon more successfully. So Carl Jaspers also talks about this, and he talks about sort of like Buddhism as the axial age religion. And so I'm not saying that he's tying it necessarily to the more Aeonic concepts, although certain kinds of Tantra would say it's Aeonic. But I agree with that more, maybe that deeper secret temple layer, where I do think that there's an Aeonic like there's clearly ideas that are parallel to like the structures of time as we see them, like institutions crumbling. How do we reconcile that? How do we rectify that? How do we, like you were saying, like how do you introduce what is essentially like a Balkan sort of like, I'm not saying that Orthodoxy is strictly cultural. People often say this about Tantra as well. It's like, oh, it's just a strictly cultural practice. No, Dharma means the truth. So we actually look for the truth. It doesn't necessarily, and maybe this is very Zen, doesn't necessarily have to be contained in the vessel that it's presented as, but we also have to retain the meanings as they are. So there's the paradox. How do you retain the meanings as they are in a new world? Because America is very young. And even
Yeah.
with like Orthodoxy or Buddhism, like Buddhism, I'll just use that example. The only introduction is from like is post-war. That's like the first time that Americans really got to experience what that is. It it took 3 times, many magical battles, many bodies on the carnal ground for it to even be introduced in Tibet. It took over 1,000 years. So how can you possibly say, oh, this religion's failed here because it didn't take root right away? No, that's not the history of religion. History of religion is it takes time. It takes clever packaging, clever marketing, and it also, and in our current time, perhaps it also takes a little bit of that mimetic sort of metafictional magic, like people like yourself who can sort of weave together maybe deeper inner ideas in an outer presentation. And maybe that's what the American magicians have been trying to do. And I don't think it's about separating us necessarily from European white identity. I'm personally mixed, but interestingly, I am from like a founder population. My mom's French Canadian. I've talked about a lot about this on the show. Her family's been here since 1604. So
Wow.
people often say, like, we're going to deport you. Well, where are you going to deport me to? So, and I'm not a leftist like at all. Like I would eschew any kind of leftist kind of framework, but I'm just saying like for like when I talk about identitarianism, I just want to be clear that I'm probably going to be on my own team rather than on, I'm not going to be totally subjective or objective, excuse me, in my like appraisal of things. I think I am, but maybe I'm not. But I just think we have to reappraise like who we are. Maybe the whole project of America is like a kind of ethnogenesis of like a population that isn't so tied to Europe. And so I also think like European religion tends to be very Saturnian. I know people love this black cube matrix, even though I don't necessarily say the black cube is Saturnian. I actually say something else. But institutional religion tends to be very Saturnian, and it tends to move very slowly, and it tends to drag people kind of through the outer congregation, if you want to call it many lifetimes or a long, long, long life experience into the inner temple. So you may not even get to the inner temple in a lifetime if you're just a regular congregational person. And I think that people know that there's more. I think people are ready to experience it. And like, yeah, we can talk about like Esalen Institute and like all the, weird shit that they did and the dolphins and all of that. But in their opinion, I'm not saying I agree, but I'm just saying in their opinion, they think that they're furthering consciousness. And maybe because we know those stories, not because we did LSD and like swam with dolphins in a isolation tank, but maybe because just simply knowing that they did that, we sort of in our minds it plants a seed, and it's like, wow, there actually might be greater experiences of consciousness possible that aren't necessarily in the physical reproduction of those acts, but maybe there's a mental component. And I think that we actually share these kinds of inner processes. I think they arise, and I think that they're very similar across tradition, much more similar than people think.
I agree. I agree totally with that. And as you were saying, some of the things that you kind of opened with, they in tonality and some specifics, it sounds so much like what certain really respected Orthodox scholars would say. So I don't know that, I mean, I'm getting sort of long in the tooth myself. So I maybe my, I mean, and as you point out, like these things can take thousands of years. But my intuition is something similar, that like it would be really cool. I don't know. I would appreciate it if um the old American idea of, or I don't know how old it is or even how true it is, but I have this idea that uh, some of the founding fathers seem to suggest that the the idea of America should be something like 10,000 or 100,000 or a million different experiments in how to live and how to conduct your life. And along the way, maybe that was um, confused or overtaken, or the narrative was hijacked. But I and maybe it's one of these things where like the masses or the lay person will not want to get on board. But if you could take, I guess maybe I can summarize it like this: if you could take a great Buddhist scholar or Zen scholar or practitioner and you know, sit in a room with him and some great Orthodox practitioner, I personally would be riveted, to see those places where there was agreement or disagreement. Like what would they really have to say to each other? Because I think it would be astonishing and fun.
I totally agree with you. I completely agree with you. And there is actually a Buddhist teacher who I often cite on the show. His name Jumi Rinpoche. He was a turn of the century polymath, and his whole thing was pragmatism. So he was also thinking in these kind of Aeonic cycle ideas. Maybe didn't call it Aeon of the Daughter. That's debatable. I could probably make a case that he did, not necessarily those terms, but the idea. But it depends on the kind of Buddhist, but for sure, we have a sun figure, a very important sun. I'm talking SON, but there is a kind of linkage to the SUN. I'm just saying in deeper esoterica, there is, but it's not necessarily the same thing. But yes, so we have a sun figure who is extremely, extremely important for certain kinds of Buddhism. And because it's also in your own consciousness. So I think a lot of the ideas of the Orthodox ideas of like Christ arising, then falling down, acting as a cork for the lower worlds, we wouldn't necessarily describe it in those exact terms, but very similar. Like the esoterica, that's the layer that interests me the most. I feel like they're often saying the same thing or a similar thing, but from a different perspective or a different view of it, of how it should be. They've come to different conclusions, but they're using maybe the same kind of ontological map to get there. And so I think that there's a lot in common. And I don't think that I think like exactly what you said. I often think of the founding fathers as kind of, well, some of them were magicians. Like, let's be honest, they were
Yeah.
members of quote unquote hellfire clubs. I'm not saying that that's good or bad. It's just a statement of fact. And so they were also interested in exploring these kind of metaphysical ideas, the deeper layer, the secret temple. And I've made a case for this, Andy, is that the Constitution is a very Mithraic, Luciferian document. That's not bad. It gives a tool, a hermeneutic, to forge yourself under these ideal conditions or as the ideal man. All political systems look to forge either the individual or the populace in their sort of terms. So, but that's if you choose to live that way. Like we were talking pre-recording, like do you configure yourself to live off the state? Or do you configure yourself to live parallel to it, or in some way engage with it in the normative way, but not necessarily not dependent on it? Well, in the U.S., there are many options. There are different, like you can live in different states. You can, homeschool your kids. There are ways to sort of navigate. It's imperfect. That's why I
Yeah.
like Junger's Anarch, because he doesn't say, "Oh, you have to live in this exact, perfect, pristine, sort of like a Nietzschean vitalist, like Tradlar kind of way." You actually can like navigate and negotiate the systems that already exist.
Absolutely. I am fascinated with the Junger's thinking in general, and I ponder the anarch more and more and more as time goes by. This kind of tension between um, needing the authority or the structure, but also needing some amount of latitude. It just makes sense even on like an engineering or kind of mechanical basis that you need these reference points, and to be able to adjust those reference points as you move through through your experience, it just seems it seems inarguably the way to go, as opposed to, I don't know, imagining that we must be forced to go back to this thing because it was written in a book, and maybe at whatever time. And that's a tension too that seems to exist with the trad thing, as I think you kind of allude to.
I'm all about maximum agency. People are now going to accuse me of being a member of the Temple of Set. That's fine. They already do, so that's fine. But I am a maximum agency person in the sense of, like, I believe that we have 100% free will. It's imperfect because we have all these man-made structures, the kind of Klopothic structures, if you want to call them that, or the Babylon, if you want to call it that, or a Merazog. I know that that's also a popular term. But yeah, we have to navigate the tunnels. You want to call, if you want to say like a Kenneth Grant term, we have to navigate these kind of Klopothic structures of that we've created. Maybe not you and me, but
Right.
we have to maximize our agency within that. First is recognizing, I am agential. I have free will. I can make choices. Not always good, not always the right one, but we can. And maybe they're imperfect and limited by degree, but we still have choices. So I think that a lot of traditional religion, but particularly the sort of trad LARP permutation it takes, I'm not saying that that is necessarily identical to traditional religion, but the way it's popularly understood maybe does tend to minimize agency and tends to blame. Look, people can have as many parapolitical or noticing beliefs as they want. I'm not in any way in opposition to that. I'm fine with that. That's, it's part of, like, we've all gone through different hermeneutics of understanding the way reality and politics kind of work and intersect. So that's fine. And I am a big fan of flexibility, like you were saying, in your framework, like not being dogmatic. I think that's a very Aeonic idea. Like, we're into pragmatism, we're like solution oriented, we're building oriented, not destruction. Because I've spoken about this too, and he said you've talked about, like, living in the Pacific Northwest and your encounters with Antifa. Like, I was never like that, but I was definitely interested in, like, left-wing politics, anarchism in particular. But I was always like more Murray Bookchin in his libertarian arc, like when he started thinking more about the American experience rather than trying to recreate the entire world from scratch. So I think that there's something interesting in that, like, we got pulled through. I always say COVID was like my big thing, and I kind of like swung back hard to the right. And then now it's not that I don't have sympathies or empathies to those politics. I do. But I also think, like, it's about moderation in your mind. So I don't want to be ideological. I don't want to be dogmatic, and I don't want to be extreme either way. But I can have friends that are in their different camps, and that's completely fine with me, because I recognize that there's some kind of relative truth to that. So I think we have to navigate it, and we have to be like men of high agency. And I think that also saying, like, your consciousness is fixed in Rome in, like, 300 BC. Was that the maximum pinnacle of what man can be? I don't personally think that. I think that actually I can be, I actually aspire to higher, personally. I'm not saying it's possible. I'm saying that I just aspire to it. So I would rather not give up my agency in that way.
Same here. Same here. I've never really taken I think you sum it up well, actually, that it's like to imagine that we could, it's a LARP, that we could somehow transmute our experience back to that, to whatever point 2,000 years ago, and even physically too, we're so much different. I think that I was going to ask, what are your thoughts on, I go back and forth on this, and occasionally I'm asked to write about AI. I can't really claim to be an expert at all, but I wonder, sometimes if we do enter into some something like a golden age where and again, just to qualify it, like, I don't know, I kind of doubt it right now, but this idea that we wouldn't necessarily have to have a job or worry so much about material needs, if that did happen, wouldn't it kind of follow that I mean, I think a lot of people would suffer from that, maybe, in terms of agency and developing. But on the other hand, a lot of people would be sort of freed up and maybe have the bandwidth to get over some of those ideological, some ideology, sure, maybe is fine or whatever, but to at least to live their lives in a way where they're not constantly having to just kind of scrap and fight for which is, and I'm not exempt from this myself. I'm not my material situation is not fantastic, and I have, 3 almost 4 little kids to provide. So it's very much topical and for me, but in speculating about it, it would be interesting if we did enter into some sort of golden age where we could kind of offlay some of this stuff to AI and apply ourselves more to the spiritual dimension. That would be neat. What do you think?
So I agree with you, Andy, that we are entering, I wouldn't say it's a golden age, I'd say it's a silver age. Because if you remember the um, Liber 49, the Great Babylon working that they did in the, Sonoran Desert in 1949, Jack Parsons and all that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so they said so Babylon, it's not the same as the famous Babylon that everybody knows from like Magic Talima and all those Kenneth Grant. It's actually like more what I'm saying, like a daughter kind of figure. And when she arises on the moon. So the planetary metal is silver. So I would say we're entering a silver age where we're actually doing the speculative work. That's what we're supposed to be doing right now. We're supposed to be doing these kinds of like reformulating ideas, synthesizing. I think that's a really interesting idea that you didn't say that word, but you said the meaning maybe more implicitly. Is that what can we do? So throw out all the arguments against UBI that we've heard for like the last 10, 20 years. I'm not saying I'm in favor or not in favor, but what I'm saying is how maybe what you're saying is that we can maximize agency, individual agency. So people will still have to make a choice. Are they going to turn on YouTube or Instagram and watch like slop content? That will be a choice just as it is now. But maybe there's also a choice that what you're saying, maybe the return, the quote unquote, we'll use a very Evolian kind of like return to nature kind of idea, is that a return to primordial like life ways, is that people will be more interested in sort of like the earth in the broad way, the sort of lands that we live on, the geo-ontological structures like sacred mountains, sacred places, sort of Gordon White, who I've interviewed, has called this like the kind of it's kind of the remagicalization. I'm not using his exact frame, I forgot. But it's kind of like it's like rediscovery of like the sort of magical nature of the world. And I think that is what it could potentially do. So I don't think it's like the golden key. I do think it's interesting that they call it. Sorry, Andy, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just kind of following your track and saying, yeah, I see where you're going. Please continue.
Well, it is interesting that they call it AI, right? Because in both Mandarin, so I speak Mandarin, and Japanese, I don't speak, but I is the word for love, right? Many people have commented on this. Well, one of the ideas of the Aeon is love without desire. So it's which is a complicated thing we won't get into, but it basically, the idea is, I think that some of them are neo-Gnostic, clearly in orientation. I mean, you know about this because a lot of the Google people are involved in directly in sort of neo-Gnostic churches. Now,
Yeah.
Gnosticism is a problematic term simply because it actually means many different things to many different people. It does not refer to a singular or Unitarian tradition. There are many orientations to it. So I do think that some of them do believe that the way to sort of create the Aeon is through AI. I don't personally believe that, but I think that AI can be a tool of man to do exactly what you said. Could it liberate us from the confines of like a strict sort of, I'll use a Marxist term, labor relations? Yeah, probably it can. Probably it will get rid of like what David Graeber always called bullshit jobs. I mean, maybe that's desirable. Maybe it's not. But we'll have to see, and we'll have to also like with being high agency, you have to navigate the ways and choose. I think that bringing that individual politics into like mass consciousness, like how do you make people agential? Well, you can't really, but you can tell them, yeah, there's actually alternatives. So I think decentralized networks, parallel structures, this is nothing new for you, Andy, like what I'm saying. But I think that this is how we kind of navigate the coming AI. I don't think it's apocalypse, although interestingly, apocalypse is also revelation. So perhaps there's newfound like ways of being in the world that are possible with this coming like rise of AI. Now, do I think the AI is the promise that they say? No. But I think it has potential. And I think that we get to choose how we use it. So I think it's an exciting time. I think like, do we really want to be born in like Kali Yuga and like, you know, like the poor are just like dying on the street from like the Black Plague? Like that doesn't, I don't know, it
No,
doesn't seem that cool to me. So I
no,
think now is a
no.
much more interesting time. And like, we get to do this. We get to have these kind of philosophical discourses, and magic, of course, arises in discourse. It has to arise in the conversations between people. That's like Plato 101.
Yeah, absolutely. I like the way you frame that a lot. I mean, and I agree. I don't think that it's set in stone. And similar too, I would agree. Yeah, I, could you imagine, 50% of Europe being wiped out by the Black Plague and then just sort of going back to the muddy bog to like have cold feet and maybe have some like gruel? I don't think that any of us want to turn back to that. But at the same time, everyone here, and I grew up with this, and it's, this is one of these places where trad LARP Christianity, um, I don't get in any fights about it. I don't even talk about it because I don't care. But the resacralization or enchantment, just appreciation of the natural world, that's a thing where, and it, I mean, on up to BC and the entire West Coast. I don't know that all of America gets that. I wish they would, but
Re-enchantment. Thank you so much, Andy. I appreciate that. That's what Gordon says, re-enchantment.
oh,
But you're
okay.
totally right about the Pacific Northwest. I was born in Vancouver myself, so I very much I feel like a special kinship connection to that area.
Vancouver is one of the most. I went there like I think it was about 1999 was the first time, maybe 97, something like that. And I remember just being struck by it was probably the most beautiful area that I had ever seen. The city, um, the the landscape. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And of course, a lot of the west coast of the United States is still incredible. But yeah, I would love to see people who wanted to do, restoration projects would be a big thing right now. But just be. I don't think that right now people even understand, generally speaking, you do. I'm sure a lot of people you talk to understand how much like satisfaction or power or peace or all of these things are actually just sitting out there waiting. And you can, you know, you hardly even have to do any work. You just quiet your mind and go enjoy some of these places, yeah, it's just, to me, it's an automatic.
Well, I love that you hyped up Vancouver. So Van City for life. Thank you so much.
Of
Um,
course.
but you know, what you're saying is true. And like people who haven't been there, it's like an incredible city on a protected, sheltered bay, and there's like islands all around, and they're tropical. Like they're not tropical, but they're temperate rainforest.
Yeah.
And it's so magic. And like, but even even going north, and maybe even going more inland, like the Yukon is incredible, the Northwest Territories are incredible. I've never been to none of it, but maybe one day. It looks very icy, but you know, there's all this mineral deposits, there's these huge mountains, there's parts that haven't even been well explored. Obviously we use quote unquote satellites. If you believe space is real, I come down on the speculative opinion that perhaps not. But I just think like there's all of this huge continent that we are here, and to think that it's fixed, to think that we're fixed in it, and that um, you know, the cartographic boundaries is that's all we know. No, that's very, I think that that idea is what COVID shattered, at least for me. Maybe not, because I've always been quite weird and into esoterica, but maybe for other people, it's kind of they've left, things can be in flux, and that's okay. You don't have to have a fixed opinion. You can just appraise things as they are in front of you, and also as they like arise in the world. That's why I don't get involved in on, especially like on Twitter. I personally don't really get involved with like um deep political questions, simply because I feel like we just have to be pragmatic, and like I'll respond to the issue as we can. But also, is it useful? Is it useful for me personally? And then also, is it useful as in, does it actually change anything? But I actually do think that there was a time, even if it's not now, I do think that there was a time where the meta magic of Twitter did actually affect maybe more gross reality in a way. Maybe not for the better, maybe for the better, I don't know. But I do think that the quote unquote powers that be definitely understand this idea of memetic magic, and how important it is, and how powerful it is, and what software really is. Software is really, like, I call it the ghost world, and anyone who's been on Twitter kind of knows that that's kind of true. Um, but there's a way to bring things like necromancy into the material creation, and I do think that that is through consciousness. So if enough people believe it, so this goes back to something that you talked about, like what story will be the next story for the golden age? What story will be our story for the silver age, if you want to call it that? Well, it will be the story that is taken up by the mass. That's pretty much, the more people believe something, just like my earlier example of Scientology or Mormonism, like I think those things are weird. I'm not going to be a Mormon. I'm not going to be a Scientologist. But you have to say that they are kind of magical, very uniquely American sort of formulations of faith. So whether I agree with them or not, or want to be part of them, they do seem to capture particular kinds of people who are interested in certain kinds of ideas. Just like politics, just like a leftist politics would capture someone, or just like rightist politics would capture someone, if depending on their state of consciousness at the time.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I don't view myself as any sort of operative. I on X, that's kind of my main internet spot these days. The internet seems to have changed so much, probably again since COVID. Um, I participate, I like to sort of monitor conversations, but similarly, I don't view my position as needing to wade into arguments. Or of course you do have to defend yourself every once in a while, but so far X has maybe I'd be more successful though if I kind of mixed it up a bit more. But so far I've just used it sort of as a, I don't know, sparingly, I guess. I have made some actual friendships through, and had met people such as yourself, and had like fascinating conversations, and I love that part of it. Um, But I also I think I probably understand the idea of the ghost world, the thing you're alluding to. It's there's a lot there. I guess we could probably go on for 5 podcasts just about that. What, speculating about what all it is, but
Well, let's turn. I'm sorry, I had all these questions about Crowbar, and I meandered us, not you. I'll take responsibility. It is my responsibility. So let's go back to Crowbar because I think this actually ties in.
yeah.
You have talked a lot about how it's pre-apocalyptic and how it's very much in the state of gray. So I really like this, and I think it also ties into the idea we talked about of like words and sounds having maybe color associations. And so what does gray mean for you in context to the novel, but also more broadly?
Well, I a lot of things, a lot of things. I I have this little idea that I return to fairly regularly about the need. I'm sure somebody like Gurdjieff has already, plowed this field, but at some point, some years ago, I started to think that it was becoming necessary to be able to enter into uncertainty, like the gray sort of is neither black nor white, but kind of both. To enter into this with black and white thinking, being able to use discernment and sort of use agency, maybe, but also the reverse has become more true or equally true along the way, where sometimes, maybe referencing our earlier lines about, trad larping and whatnot. Sometimes what seems black and white is just better treated with some gray, like non not being, of course there's a time where maybe you have to draw your line in the sand, but oftentimes it just seems to me better to sort of wait and watch. And so I will think a lot of times this just appears like life is like this. Like I don't know um whether AI will turn out great or whether it will bring about the apocalypse. I'm not really in charge. I'm trying to pay attention. But the pre-apocalyptic part, we could probably plays in here a fair bit, with ideas of the veil and whatnot. But I suppose you're right that both my books, King of Dogs and Crowbar, are sort of pre-apocalyptic. The King of Dogs is more so, when we talk about genres of books, you have this apocalyptic genre where the nukes have gone up or the volcano has blown, and so now people are, engaged in cannibalism or what have you. There's another stage of collapse or decline that's more interesting to me, and I hopefully we're not actually headed that direction, but in many ways I think it's inarguable that aspects of our lives are in collapse and decline, and maybe it's back to, the renewal rebirth sort of thing. But the pre-apocalyptic is a pretty interesting, I think, frame maybe to approach these things, because in practical terms, as an author, you can still use just about anything. I can blend in spiritual sorts of qualities with pre-existing technology or structures, social structures, what have you. And so, yeah, there's more thinking to do on the on the black and white and gray relationship to the pre-apocalyptic. I'm not sure. I tie this in a lot of times with the noir genre of film and literature, where the detective sort of character is often depicted in these conditions where he's going into sort of an amoral, uncertain territory, and he's going to have to kind of himself. We can pull up many examples. One of my favorites is LA Confidential, where the character Ed Exley sort of begins his arc as sort of stuffy, sort of inexperienced and by the book. And then he is bent along the way to realizing that he's just going to have to break rules in order to get shit done. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the predecessor characters going back to the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they do all seem to share this experience where new information is going to come to light. They're going to have to deal and process this and then kind of make some decisions. And I, for whatever reason, I tend to come down on the side where we break rules, but we're still sort of responsible for them. That's the character that I tend to identify with, and so maybe I write characters like that.
I often say it's the Aeon of the antihero. I'm not saying that you're saying that that's the antihero, but I do kind of like that framing. I don't think the antihero is always the bad guy.
Me neither.
And so I actually think that in our current times, that's exactly the kind of archetype that's needed, more than someone who's going to strictly follow the rules, as you said.
I agree.
Well,
Yeah, I agree.
and I think that if you live in so if we agree that maybe you don't agree, but I think broadly people listening agree that we live in like a Klapothic or Babylonian or whatever they want to call it structure, maybe being a little bit of a rule breaker is exactly what is needed to sort of like, break those things so we can break those conceptual boundaries. I'm not saying do anything bad. As you said, we have to be responsible for the rules that we break and the ways that we engage with it. You don't have to go sicko or don't have to go extreme, but there are negotiations that can be had, I think, with certain things that I agree takes a deal, at least a degree of amorality, which is very different than immorality. So I think people tend to forget that. And I think people are a lot more, I'm not saying people are immoral, but I do think people are a lot more amoral in that they don't necessarily have fixed conceptual ideas of like, why is this, why are we at war here? I think they just take sides either way.
Yeah.
But I think that most people aren't going to think about that in their daily life. Like, I don't think people, excuse me for swearing, but I don't think people give a shit.
Yeah, me neither. I agree. I wish they did.
But I think there's something really interesting metaphysically about what you're talking about, particularly because you have stylized margins in the book. And so the black can be linked to text. I know this sounds very facile, but actually in Kabbalah, this makes sense. Is the black is understanding, bina. It's textual knowledge, textual understanding, maybe not knowledge, but and then the kind of quote unquote, you could call it white, but sometimes you can also call it gray, is associated with wisdom. So it's experiential wisdom, very much like Greek Orthodox saints. And so the whole idea is that you bring the textual understanding into the experiential wisdom, and then what arises is knowledge. So that can also be considered gray. It's a different quality of gray than wisdom, but very much that is a good association. So so like you're saying, you did break a couple. No, I didn't say you broke rules. You just did your own stylistic thing, which I appreciate because that's what writing is. It's like we should be treating, in my opinion, we should be treating words as kind of aesthetic objects as well. and we should be playing with form, and we shouldn't be necessarily totally bound to like the just because someone tells us this is like the formal structure it should be. I don't necessarily think, I think a skilled person can negotiate that.
Yeah, I was just telling this to my son last night. He's not quite ready to understand this, but I was explaining to him that a musician, as one example, if you learn the rules very well, then you're going to be adept at breaking them strategically or aesthetically or just as needed.
Well, it's that's what it is. It's the as needed and
Yeah.
strategically, and I totally agree with that. I mean, that was a great way to put it. I wish I had said that. Is, it's yeah, it is about the sort of pressure points that you can sort of play with things without being like, oh, I'm going to bring it to this dogma, or I'm going to bring it here. I have one more book question, Andy, and
Yeah.
I know that we had like a very far-ranging conversation, but one of the things that I took note of in another interview setting in the early 1980s is generational malaise. So personally, I'm millennial, so this is a common sort of we look at Gen X as being natural rebels. So they rebel against the kind of the boomer ideas of the world, or at least the boomer norms and conventions. I think that there's a interesting way that rebellion gets framed in generational terms and how we each process it. So a lot of Gen X people, I'm not saying this is true for you, and I don't think this is true for you, but they tend to black pill. And millennials tend to use irony humor to sort of insulate themselves from the black pill, but they might actually be black pilled at heart. Where Zoomers will say, oh, we're all about sincerity, be yourself, but it's a very performative kind of way to go about that as well. So I think every generation kind of has these inclinations that make them susceptible perhaps to rebellion just for the sake of rebellion, like just they're rejecting norms, but it's just for the sake of rejecting norms, rather than saying, what can we do pragmatically, practically, or even to improve our own agency, our own experiences in this world? How can we navigate and negotiate that? So I guess my question is that now that you are a father, I mean, I'm not saying you weren't a father when you wrote this book, because obviously you were, but I think that how will you negotiate it in the future, in future works, this idea of generational malaise and rebellion, now that you have these more experiences of the quote unquote traditional nuclear family?
I got to tell you, that is one of the best questions I have probably ever been asked in my entire life. Thank you very much. I'm gonna
Wow,
have to.
thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's phenomenal, actually. It really goes to the first thing that comes to mind is it goes right to the heart, actually, of being a father. And that's why I think this question is so amazing. Is I maybe can frame it like this. Um, so I have a friend who lives I live south of Portland, about 4 hours, and he's still in Portland. This is where we grew up. I've known him since I was, I think, 14. So we've known each other like 35 years or something, 30 years. And he has kids. They're a little bit older than mine. I hadn't seen him in, like 7 years. I went up there. This was like last spring, I guess. And we picked up like old friends do, like really good friends do, just seamlessly. It's a magical thing itself. And we hadn't been together more than a few minutes. And he said, how are your kids, or something like that. And I said something to the effect of, well, they're great. Everybody's physically and psychically, mentally good. I'm just, of course, preparing myself to to try and explain the world, or frame it, or somehow show my, because I have all boys. I have 3 boys and then another one coming, which I'm very happy with. It does present different challenges than I imagine being a father to daughters would present. But I said, I'm just anticipating the time where I need to explain, like, how do I do this? How do I explain to them, well, we sort of had a world that I grew up in that was kind of tethered to this boomer generation that my father lived through, that was seemingly just rock solid. My upbringing was really kind of idyllic in many ways. We didn't really hurt for anything. My parents stuck together. I mean, it was pretty close actually to like 1950s America, even in the 80s for me. It was different. But I'll leave that aside just to finish this point to say, I was telling my friend, trying to frame this kind of angst-ridden, anticipatory feeling about, well, I have to frame my conception of the world for my boys and then also teach them how to survive in it. And rebellion, like against the father, is this classic, I mean, talk about a spiritual theme, right? I mean, the father wound, and the holy father, father, prodigal son. I mean, we have all of this kind of material that just seems to be laying around. And I will add, just sort of as a tangent, maybe this is useful. It has been remarkable to be an older dude, and then, because time just like assaults you. That's been my experience. Like, all of those cliches about it moving fast, and that's all very much true, and but it makes no difference that it. You're still like shocked. But to look back, or kind of behind me, if you will, and now sort of parallel and even overtaking Gen X, I have, because I have no idea what guys such as yourself, your age, are doing. I'm sort of ahead in life doing other things, but to look back and realize, like, man, these guys kind of have it together. This could turn out okay. These guys actually know and are oriented to reality, your generation, in a way that Gen X, myself included, we were not. We did manage, to our credit. I think that we were, maybe the only thing that Gen X has going for it is the cliches about being raised just kind of like free range. This is true. All those stories about just kind of being let loose in the morning and doing whatever you wanted, and if you made it home at night, like, it's all good. That really was true. And I don't again, I don't have enough personal experience to say how common that is for millennials and Zoomers, but as I think about your question, like, the ways to rebel, I hope are not too painful. It seems to be, I guess, where I'm trying to drive this is that I hope that your generation does not have to, and it may be like, there's a lot of, like you said, like, doom and gloom. um it may actually not turn out to be that bad, though. And I'm not sure the role that Gen X is set to play. Maybe it's like, sort of a wise, or just older sort of advisory figure on the side. I just feel like your generation is going to do, this is fourth turning and all of that stuff. You guys are going to have to take the helm and invent some new stuff, financial systems, social systems, all sorts of systems. And probably the way that God works is that you guys can handle it. And when the boomers finally do exit stage left, there's probably going to be some upheaval. It's probably going to go on for a while, but I think we're going to make it. I didn't used to think that, actually. I wasn't sure. And I'm not trying to say that Xers will play some sort of paternal role at all. I think it's not that way. It's maybe brotherly or just advisory. So there's something special about your generation that maybe is only going to be shown like in the fullness of time. You guys still have a long ways to go. Gen X really never even took power, so to speak. I mean, we have a few sort of, pardon the expression, but turds, sort of in high positions. Nobody I know of my generation has any respect or admiration for, hardly even our artists, much less our politicians or business leaders or anything like that. So maybe the setup that God or fate or whatever has given us is that you guys are going to have a little better read on these things. And maybe you would be able to use this, not my conception, but some sort of conception of entering into the gray with the black and white and vice versa, applying the gray to what seems black and white. And together, I think we will limp through the next 100 years, and then we'll probably have to see what happens then. Is that in any way answer your question?
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Gen X are the cultural critics, the elder, the unks, you could say, to use for a term from online. Yeah, for sure. I think that's what I think personally. I think that it serves that generation perfectly to sort of cast aspersions on the system as they see it and as you've experienced it, and through like the deeper, if you want to use like a Peter Dale Scott term, like the deep politics of it all. Like, you're not saying like it's this conspiracy per se, but you're saying like there's a mechanism that's deeper than the political layer that we see. I think everybody kind of agrees and knows that that's true. And you'd have to be like really normie to not sort of recognize that. And I think that that's what Gen X is poised particularly to do, is to always be cynical. But I do think that obviously cynicism shouldn't be like overplayed where it's going to the point of black pill, but because I do agree with you 100% that we are going to make it. And I think the interesting thing about the sort of the Aeonic framework is the Aeon of the Daughter is perfectly complementary to the Aeon of the Sun. So to even go back to the very beginning, is that some of the aeons work better together, like the sort of the thinking of it. So maybe your generation has the cutoff from like the boomer patriarchy, to use a leftist term. But that's okay, because then like millennials and even the Zoomers, they can actually be the fullness of the sun. Because we kind of are leaving both the longhouse and sort of the institutional frame.
Oh, well said. Yeah, I think that's better said than because that's probably like a firm takeaway. In fact, I will probably use that. I'll probably rewind this.
No, please do, Andy. I would be very flattered if you took anything that I said as interesting or even relevant. So
no, that's a great frame, because those are, the longhouse and these weird, back to the gray, it's like these things are not, but yeah, I mean, you just did it. In fact, I think you just applied the black and the white to the gray expertly. So well done.
Thank you. I'm a pretty good magician most of the time, at least speculative, but theoretically I'm pretty good. So I'll take that compliment. Thank you very much, Andrew. And please plug yourself and your incredible book. I want everybody who listens to this episode, but perhaps to the show in general, to buy it. And also like to show, like, I know you'll have at least one sale. I know that someone will buy a hard copy because he always does. And I just want to say thank you again so much for you coming on. I know we inhabit a little bit different parts of Twitter, but I'm adjacent, and I think I'm getting a little more adjacent depending on the people that have asked to come on. So it's a huge honor, really is. No bullshit. And I think you did a great work, we'll call it. And I love your podcast, and I love King of Dogs.
Well, thank you very much. Likewise, this is one of the best chats that I've ever had. So I'm really grateful to you for, setting the stage and letting me stretch a little bit. That's a treat. As far as the books and where I'm at, X is the main place, and there's a LinkTree. It's at the top of the LinkTree. It'll take you right to Amazon. And absolutely, buy as many books as you possibly can. It's my main, I'm one of the few people that's I burned the ships. This is my main thing. So thank you very much for that. There's other stuff on that LinkTree. I am on Instagram, but it's more just habit and reposting the same stuff. What else to say? As far as X, I'm happy that we're connected now, because in just kind of picking around and seeing your posts, it's exposed me to a whole dimension of X and reality at large that I wasn't really aware of. So I'll be around, and I'll be participating where I can.
Awesome. And I just want to say on recording, for the record, that you are invited on anytime you want to cross the threshold.